The sound cracked through the air like a gunshot, silencing every conversation, every clinking spoon, and every rustling napkin in the cafe. For a moment, time itself seemed to freeze. Naomi felt the sting explode across her cheek, radiating a burning heat. The sharp impact sent her head jerking slightly to the side, but she did not stumble. She did not flinch. She did not flinch. She did not gasp. Instead, she stood still, shoulders squared, eyes locked forward. The cafe, once buzzing with morning chatter and the hum of espresso machines, was now steeped in a suffocating silence. Customers sitting at their tables, baristas behind the counter, even the man at the register holding his coffee, all of them stared, frozen in shock. The weight of what had just occurred pressed down on every soul in the room. Ethan Briggs, the uniformed officer standing before Naomi, had his hand still hovering midair. His fingers twitched slightly, as if even he was startled by his own action. His face remained stony, lips curled in a sneer of superiority. But there was something flickering in his eyes, uncertainty. Naomi slowly turned her head back to face him. No anger, no fear, just an eerie, unsettling calm. Someone in the cafe audibly gasped. A woman near the counter holding a half-stirred latte raised her phone, her fingers fumbling to hit the record button. A man in a suit sitting by the window shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands clenched into fists on the table. The atmosphere was suffocating, an electric storm crackling with tension. Briggs took a step forward, his boots thudding heavily against the polished floor. His badge glinted under the soft cafe lighting, but the arrogance in his posture outshone it. "You better step outside," he growled, voice low, firm. A warning, a threat. Resisting an officer is a bad idea, lady. Naomi remained motionless, staring at him, unblinking. Her silence was deafening. Behind her, a barista shifted uneasily, looking toward the cafe's manager, unsure of what to do. An older woman near the pastry display clutched her handbag tighter, eyes darting between Naomi and the officer. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the quiet hum of the espresso machine, still running, still oblivious to the storm brewing in the middle of the room. Then slowly, deliberately, Naomi reached into her pocket. A ripple of tension passed through the cafe. Briggs's hand twitched toward his holster, and then she pulled out a small, black leather case. With an icy composure, Naomi flipped it open and slammed it onto the table between them. The cafe gasped as one. Briggs's face was drained of color. His eyes locked onto the badge in front of him, the one that read, Cassandra Carter, Chief of Police. Silence. Then Naomi finally spoke. Her voice was calm, steady, deadly. "Home. Steady. Deadly." "Ethan Briggs," she said. "You're under arrest." Naomi inhaled slowly, letting the breath steady her. The sharp sting on her cheek was still fresh, the skin burning from the force of the slap, but pain wasn't what occupied her mind. Control was. Her gaze remained locked onto Ethan Briggs. She studied him, not just his uniform, his badge, or the holster at his side, but the way his jaw tightened ever so slightly, the flicker of unease in his eyes before arrogance smothered it. Across the cafe, the weight of silent judgment pressed down on every soul present. The air felt thick, suffocating, charged with unspoken words. Then a rustle. Someone reached for their phone. A young woman near the bar, wide-eyed and breathless, lifted her phone just enough to record without drawing attention. Another man near the window, still frozen in his seat, subtly tilted his screen toward the scene, capturing every moment. Briggs's nostrils flared. He noticed. His gaze darted around the cafe, taking in the sea of prying eyes, the quiet rebellion unfolding in real time. A bead of sweat glistened at his temple, though he masked it well beneath his hardened exterior. His authority was slipping, and he knew it. Yet still he held his ground. His fingers twitched at his belt, inching toward his holster, not as a real threat, not yet, but as a reminder, a display of power, a message. Then he spoke. His voice was low, firm, controlled rage barely masked beneath professionalism. "You better step outside," he growled. "Resisting an officer is a bad idea, lady." The words hung in the air, heavy with menace. Naomi didn't move. Her heartbeat remained steady. Her posture remained firm. But beneath the surface, something dangerous stirred. Resisting, her fingers curled into her palm, the sting on her cheek a constant reminder of his audacity. He thought she was some random woman, someone powerless, someone beneath him. She was none of those things. The silence stretched. Then Naomi took a step forward. Not backward, not away. Forward. Briggs stiffened. The café held its breath. And in that instant she knew she had him. The tension in the café was suffocating. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the espresso machine in the background, an odd contrast to the storm brewing in the center of the room. Naomi exhaled slowly, deliberately. Then, without breaking eye contact, she reached into her pocket. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Briggs's hand twitched toward his holster. A reflex, a warning. But he didn't draw. Not yet. He was still in control, at least. That's what he told himself. Naomi's fingers brushed against the smooth leather case. She pulled it out. The movement was slow, unrushed, measured. And then she slammed it onto the table. The sound cracked through the air like a judge's gavel. 1 second. 2 seconds. Briggs's smug arrogance drained from his face. His lips parted slightly, as if his mind was still struggling to process what he was seeing. His eyes scanned the badge. Once. Twice. His Adam's apple bobbed. Cassandra Carter, Chief of Police. His cheeks lost all color. The café erupted. A chorus of gasps and murmurs filled the space, breaking the tense silence. Someone whispered, "No way. She's the chief." Another voice, "Holy hell. Did that guy just slap his own boss?" The young woman near the counter, still holding up her phone, zoomed in on Briggs's face, recording every flicker of fear. The man by the window let out a low whistle, shaking his head. Briggs took an instinctive step back, his breath hitched, his fingers twitching uselessly at his sides. He looked around the café, as if searching for an escape, for an authority higher than her. But there was none. Naomi tilted her head, watching him, studying him. Then finally she spoke. Her voice was steady, cold, unshakable. "Ethan Briggs," she said, her words slicing through the murmurs. "You're under arrest." Cassandra Carter was no stranger to the weight of responsibility. The first black female chief of police in the city's history, her appointment had been hailed as a step toward progress, a sign that change was finally on the horizon. But change, she quickly learned, was a slow and stubborn beast. Her title gave her power, but it did not grant her immunity from the obstacles that came with it. Every meeting, every decision, every policy she introduced, there were always whispers, always resistance, both spoken and unspoken. She had worked twice as hard, climbed twice as high, and sacrificed more than she cared to admit to get to this position. Yet even now, sitting at the very top, she could feel the weight of the system pressing down on her. And lately that weight had only grown heavier. The city had been shaken by a series of complaints, disturbing reports of racial profiling, excessive force, and misconduct within the police force. But these weren't just isolated incidents. The evidence pointed to a pattern. Naomi had spent weeks combing through files, reviewing footage, and listening to testimonies. The same names kept appearing. Officers who had dozens of complaints filed against them, but had never faced real consequences. And among those names, one stood out like a stain that refused to be erased. Ethan Briggs. The reports against him were as damning as they were numerous. Unlawful searches, unprovoked aggression, targeting black citizens under the guise of routine stops, threatening those who tried to file complaints. Yet he was still in uniform, still patrolling the streets, still abusing his authority. And the worst part, he wasn't acting alone. There was a network, a group of officers who operated with impunity, covering for each other, bending the rules in their favor. A brotherhood of corruption, protected by red tape and bureaucratic inaction. Naomi knew what this meant. She knew that if she followed protocol, if she waited for the internal investigations to run their course, justice might never come. She had spent too much time in this system to believe otherwise. And so she made a choice. She wouldn't wait. She wouldn't watch from behind a desk as her officers tarnished the badge. She would go into the field. She would expose them herself. Naomi had always believed in leading by example. If she expected her officers to put themselves at risk, to confront injustice head-on, she had to be willing to do the same. So she crafted a plan. She would go undercover, not as an officer, not as someone with power, but as an ordinary black woman. She stripped away her badge, her title, and her authority. For the past week, she had walked the streets without her uniform, without her protection. She had deliberately placed herself in situations where Calloway and his men were most likely to strike. She had waited for them to reveal their true nature, and now, standing in the middle of this café, with the red mark of his slap still burning on her cheek, she knew that her plan had worked. Calloway had exposed himself, and now he would face the consequences. The plan had to be flawless. Naomi knew she was walking into enemy territory, a district notorious for racial profiling, excessive force, and officers who treated the badge like a weapon instead of a responsibility. It was no accident that she chose this place. The café sat on the edge of a gentrified neighborhood, where old storefronts clashed with sleek, overpriced coffee shops. It was the kind of place where certain people were welcome, and others were merely tolerated. Black customers had long complained about being watched too closely, or being served too slowly. Some had even been escorted out by the police over nothing more than a cashier's discomfort. And more often than not, Mark Briggs was the officer who responded. Naomi had spent months reviewing complaints. The patterns were undeniable. This was his hunting ground, and now it would be his downfall. Naomi stood in front of her bedroom mirror, stripping away every trace of authority. No badge, no uniform, no gun. Instead, she slipped into a simple oversized hoodie, worn jeans, a faded cap pulled low over her eyes. She became invisible. She knew exactly what Briggs and officers like him saw when they looked at a black woman dressed like this. Not a professional, not a leader, not a person deserving of respect, and that was exactly what she needed. Her fingers brushed the badge still sitting on her dresser. The weight of it was familiar, comforting. It had taken her years to earn it, and seconds to decide to leave it behind. She hesitated, then grabbed it anyway. Not to wear, but for when the moment was right. The café was busy when she arrived, filled with the usual morning crowd. Young professionals hunched over laptops, an elderly couple sharing a quiet conversation, and baristas moving briskly behind the counter. No one paid her any mind as she walked in. She ordered a coffee, keeping her voice even, deliberately neutral. Then she took a seat by the window, her back straight, but her posture relaxed. And then she waited. She didn't have to wait long. The door swung open with the sharp chime of the entrance bell. A familiar presence filled the space. Heavy boots, a stiff stance, the unmistakable air of authority misused. Ethan Briggs. Naomi didn't look up immediately, but she could feel his eyes scanning the café, looking for trouble, looking for someone who didn't belong, and sure enough his gaze landed on her. She kept her breathing steady as he walked closer. She could already predict his thought process. Black woman, alone, hoodie, sitting a little too comfortably. Not a threat, but not welcome either. It started the way these situations always did, with a simple question disguised as a challenge. "Morning, ma'am." His voice was casual, but his stance wasn't. It was confrontational, invasive. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" Naomi took a sip of her coffee. Then she looked up, meeting his eyes. "I'm drinking my coffee," she said plainly. His jaw twitched. That wasn't the answer he wanted. She could see it in his expression, the slow, simmering frustration of a man used to control, used to intimidation. "Well, I got a call about some suspicious behavior," he lied, placing a hand on his belt. "Mind if I see some ID?" And just like that, he fell into the trap. Naomi reached into her pocket, but not for her badge, not yet. Instead, she pulled out her wallet, moving slowly, deliberately. She could feel the weight of the café's silence pressing down around him. Briggs took that as hesitation, as guilt, and then he made his fatal mistake. Before she could even hand over the ID, his hand shot out, a sharp smack against her face. The café gasped in unison. Naomi didn't move, didn't react. She just let the moment sit, let the weight of his actions settle into the air, into the silence. And then, finally, she reached into her pocket one last time, and this time she pulled out the badge. Naomi entered the café like any other customer. She kept her posture relaxed, her movements unassuming. Just another woman stopping for morning coffee. Nothing more, nothing less. The scent of freshly brewed espresso filled the air as baristas worked swiftly behind the counter. The space buzzed with quiet chatter, the occasional clatter of ceramic cups breaking the monotony. She stepped into line, her hands casually tucked into the pocket of her hoodie. To everyone else, she was just another face in the crowd, but not to Calloway. Naomi reached the counter and ordered her coffee, keeping her voice neutral. "Medium black coffee, please." The cashier nodded, barely looking up, before punching in the order. It was an ordinary moment, one that should have passed unnoticed, until, as Naomi reached for a drink, her elbow barely grazed the arm of the man next to her. It wasn't even a real spill. Just a few drops of coffee splashed onto the counter. The man, a middle-aged businessman in a crisp suit, didn't even flinch. "No problem," he said with a small shrug, already grabbing a napkin to wipe the counter. But before Naomi could even step back, a sharp voice cut through the cafe. "Hey!" The room shifted. The air tightened. Naomi didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Ethan Briggs. He was standing just a few feet away, arms crossed, his expression already set in a mix of disapproval and arrogance. His voice carried across the cafe, deliberately loud. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Naomi barely raised an eyebrow. She glanced at the businessman, who was still wiping his counter, clearly unbothered. "I was picking up my coffee," she said smoothly, turning back to Briggs. "Is there a problem?" Briggs took a step closer. Too close. There was something calculated about the way he positioned himself, blocking her path, making sure everyone in the cafe saw. "You just caused a disturbance," he said, "and I don't appreciate your attitude." Naomi tilted her head. "My attitude?" She took a sip of her coffee. Slow. Unbothered. Briggs's jaw clenched. He was expecting fear. He wasn't getting it. And that only made him push harder. A few people in the cafe shifted uncomfortably. Some stole glances at the situation, but quickly looked away. Others whispered in hushed voices, unsure if they should intervene. Then a young woman near the window pulled out her phone. That was when Naomi knew. The situation had just escalated. Not because of her, not because of the coffee spill, but because Briggs wanted it to. "Need you to step outside." Briggs's voice wasn't a request. Naomi met his eyes. "Step outside for what?" "For causing a public disturbance." She let out a small, almost amused breath. "Over a few drops of coffee? You're being difficult," he snapped. "And resisting an officer is a bad idea, lady." That word, lady, it was dripping with condescension. Naomi could see it all so clearly now. This was his game, his routine. Find a black person, find an excuse, make them obey. And when they didn't, make them an example. Briggs took another step forward, crowding her space. He didn't care that people were watching. He didn't care that there were cameras. He only cared about control. And when Naomi still didn't step back, he made his move. His hand shot out. A sharp, violent motion. A slap. He opened the chair. The sound ripped through the cafe. A collective gasp filled the room. Naomi felt the sting on her cheek. But she didn't react. She didn't flinch. She just let the weight of the moment settle. And then, very slowly, she reached into her pocket. And this time, she pulled out her badge. The cafe was dead silent. Everyone had just witnessed the slap. Some customers froze in shock. Others exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to step in or stay out of it. A few had their phones out, capturing every second. And Naomi didn't react the way Briggs expected. She didn't recoil. She didn't raise her voice. She just stood there, calm, steady, unshaken. That only made him angrier. He strode forward, closing the distance between them. His boots echoed against the tiled floor. His presence was meant to intimidate. But Naomi remained still. Briggs's hand hovered near his holster, not drawing his weapon, but making sure she saw where it was. His voice, cold and controlled, cut through the air. "You just caused a disturbance." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Over a coffee spill?" Briggs's jaw clenched. "Either walk out now, or I'll take you in." A small, knowing smirk tugged at the corner of Naomi's lips. She didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even break eye contact. Instead, she lifted her cup, took a slow sip, and set it down deliberately. "I'm just having my coffee." Her voice was even, measured, and that was what infuriated Briggs the most. Whispers rippled through the cafe. Some customers pretended not to see, shrinking into their seats. Others watched, uncertain, their gazes darting between Briggs and Naomi. And then someone spoke. A woman near the counter, nervous but firm. She didn't do anything. Briggs's head snapped toward her. "Mind your business." His tone was sharp, a warning. The woman shrunk back, but the moment was already shifting. A few more customers lifted their phones. The situation was no longer just about Briggs's authority. Now it was public, and he hated that. His voice dropped lower, his patience fraying. "You are resisting an officer. Last chance." Naomi tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. "Resisting?" she echoed, her voice smooth. Briggs's nostrils flared. "I will arrest you." The weight of his words hung in the air. A challenge, a dare, a final warning. But Naomi didn't budge, didn't blink, didn't break, because this was exactly what she had been waiting for. And Briggs had just walked right into the trap. Tension coiled around the room, like a live wire. The cafe had become a battleground, and everyone knew something was about to break. Would Briggs put his hands on her again? Would he pull out his cuffs and make a public scene? Would someone finally intervene? Or would Naomi play her final card? The answer came when, with absolute control, she reached into her pocket and placed her badge on the table. The cafe was suffocatingly silent. The tension was unbearable. And then Briggs snapped. His frustration boiled over, exploding into action. Before anyone could react, before even he could think, his hand flew across Naomi's face. Cha! The impact echoed through the cafe, a sharp, sickening sound that seemed to freeze time itself. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Customers stiffened. Some jerked backward. Others simply stared in horror. The weight of what just happened crashed down all at once. An officer, a public place, a black woman, a slap, and not just any woman, a woman who was about to end his career. Naomi didn't flinch, didn't stumble, didn't even raise a hand to her burning cheek. Her head had turned slightly with the force of the slap, but when she looked back, her eyes locked onto Calloway's, steady, unwavering, cold. Her calmness was terrifying, more terrifying than if she had yelled, more terrifying than if she had retaliated, because it meant she was in control. Calloway, on the other hand, had just lost everything. The cafe had gone from a simple coffee shop to the stage of a breaking scandal. Customers were no longer just bystanders. They were witnesses. Phones were out, recording, live streaming, documenting. Some people still looked too shocked to move, but others were furious. A man near the counter spoke first. "You just hit her. You just..." A woman's voice trembled with outrage. "You can't do that. What is wrong with you?" Another more direct. "That's assault." The room turned against Briggs in an instant, and Briggs felt it, felt the shift, felt the eyes on him, felt the weight of what he had just done crashing down. For the first time he hesitated. His breathing was uneven. His hand trembled slightly. He had meant to intimidate her. He had meant to put her in her place. But now he was the one trapped. His career? Over. His reputation? Destroyed. His fate sealed. And the worst part? She knew it. Slowly, deliberately, Naomi reached into her pocket. Briggs stiffened. Was she going for a weapon? A phone? Was she about to call for backup? No, it was worse. Naomi pulled out her badge, and then she slammed it onto the table. The sound was small, but the shock wave it sent through the room was massive. Briggs's eyes dropped to the badge. He read the name. Once, twice, 3 times, as if the words might somehow change if he stared hard enough. But they didn't. They never would, because they were real, and they meant one thing. He had just slapped the chief of police. The cafe exploded with voices. Some gasped, some cursed, some laughed, a bitter, knowing laugh. And Briggs just stood there, frozen, silent, because for the first time in his career, he had no power left. And Naomi? Naomi just smiled, because this was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment that would change everything. The room was a storm of voices. Anger, shock, outrage, and at the center of it all, Briggs. Frozen. Stunned. Trapped. His mouth opened slightly, as if he was about to say something. An excuse, a denial, anything. But nothing came out, because there was nothing he could say. Naomi picked up her badge, holding it firmly between her fingers. Her voice was steady, unwavering. "Ethan Briggs, you are under arrest." A hush fell over the cafe. Even those who had been shouting moments ago paused, watching intently. Briggs blinked. Once. Twice. Then he scoffed, a dry, humorless sound. "You can't be serious." Naomi took a step closer. Assaulting a civilian is a crime. Assaulting a superior officer? That's career-ending. Briggs's jaw clenched. His arrogance faltered, but he still tried to salvage control. "You set this up," he muttered, shaking his head. This was a damn trap. Naomi didn't deny it, because it was. And it worked perfectly. The commotion inside the cafe hadn't gone unnoticed. Within minutes, 2 uniformed officers pushed through the crowd, their hands hovering near their holsters. They took in the scene, the recording phones, Briggs standing stiffly, and Naomi. One officer, Officer Jordan Mills, hesitated when he recognized Briggs. "Ethan," his voice was uncertain. "What's going on here?" Naomi turned to him, her presence commanding. "What's going on?" She repeated. "Your superior just assaulted a civilian, and he's going to answer for it." Jordan Mills looked at Briggs, uncertain. "Chief, are you sure we should? Are you questioning a lawful order?" Naomi cut in sharply. The weight of her words hit like a hammer. Daniel swallowed hard. He turned to Briggs, eyes flickering with uncertainty. This wasn't just another complaint that could be buried. There were too many witnesses, too much evidence. And worst of all, the badge on Naomi's chest made it undeniable. With a heavy breath, Jordan Mills reached for his handcuffs. As Jordan Mills moved forward, Briggs took a step back. His eyes darted toward the door, toward the narrowing gap of opportunity. His mind raced. Maybe if he left now, if he could just get to his car, he could control the narrative before this got worse. But then a voice cut through the air. "Don't even think about it." Naomi's tone was low, dangerous, and for the first time that night Briggs actually looked afraid. The cafe was now completely sealed off. No escape. No way out. Jordan Mills and his partner closed in. Briggs stiffened. Even now he hesitated, as if he still believed there was a way out of this, as if he still believed he had power. He didn't. Click. The cold steel of handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists, a sharp, final sound. The cafe erupted. Some customers cheered, others laughed bitterly, and many just recorded. Because this wasn't just an arrest, this was history in the making. The moment Briggs was let out of the cafe, the real battle began. The videos already uploaded, the headlines already being written. Within minutes, the footage spread like wildfire. The caption trended instantly. "Racist cops slaps black woman, turns out she's the chief of police." Millions clicked. Thousands commented. The city erupted in outrage, and Calloway, once untouchable, was now the face of a national scandal. As she watched Calloway being led away, Naomi exhaled slowly. She had set out to expose corruption, and she had succeeded. But this was just the beginning, because now, with the world watching, the system would have no choice but to change. The air was electric. Hundreds of reporters crowded in front of City Hall, their cameras flashing as they focused on the woman standing behind the podium. Naomi Carter, the city's first black female chief of police, stood tall, her expression unreadable. She had faced countless battles in her career, but this was the moment everything changed. She cleared her throat and leaned into the microphone. "I stand before you today not just as chief of police, but as a citizen who believes in justice." The crowd fell silent. What happened at that cafe was not an isolated incident. A murmur ran through the audience. For too long, officers like Ethan Briggs have abused their power. They've harassed, assaulted, and wrongfully arrested innocent black citizens, all while hiding behind their badges. Naomi's voice hardened. "That ends today." The silence was deafening. And then, the explosion of questions. Reporters shouted over one another as Naomi held up a hand. "I have launched a full-scale investigation into corruption and racial discrimination within our department, and I promise you, every officer guilty of misconduct will be held accountable. The flash of cameras intensified. The world was watching, and there was no turning back now. Within hours, an internal probe was underway. Naomi personally assembled a team of independent investigators, experts in police accountability. They combed through hundreds of complaints, body cam footage, and whistleblower testimonies. And what did they find? A system built on silence and fear. Officers falsifying reports. Racial profiling being encouraged in certain districts. Excessive force complaints being buried. Briggs was just the tip of the iceberg. There were dozens of officers like him, protected by the blue wall of silence. But now that wall was crumbling. The more they uncovered, the darker Briggs's record became. He had multiple excessive force complaints none investigated, wrongfully arrested over 30 black citizens, been caught on tape using racial slurs, covered up by his superiors. And the worst, a leaked internal memo showed that high-ranking officials knew about his behavior and did nothing. The city erupted in outrage. Community leaders demanded swift action. And Naomi? She didn't hesitate. Effective immediately, Mark Briggs is terminated from the police force. Additionally, we are forwarding all evidence to the district attorney's office for criminal charges. The crowd cheered. But Naomi knew this wasn't over. Because Briggs wasn't the only one. The investigation moved quickly. Within 2 weeks, 10 officers were placed on administrative leave. Within a month, 5 were fired and arrested, and by the second month, half of Calloway's division was under investigation. Officers resigned before they could be fired. The department's leadership was forced to answer for years of cover-ups. Civil rights groups pushed for sweeping reforms. The public demanded justice, and under Naomi's leadership, they got it. Across the city, people marched, not in anger, but in hope. The sight of a black woman in power, taking down systemic corruption, was a turning point. News anchors called it historic. Activists called it a reckoning. But Naomi? She called it just the beginning. Because justice wasn't about one man falling. It was about rebuilding the system entirely. Standing in her office, Naomi watched as the sun set over the city. She had won a battle. But the war against injustice? That fight would never stop. Not until the system truly changed. She picked up her phone, dialing a number. Let's get started on the next phase. Because this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The investigation was just the beginning. Firing corrupt officers wasn't enough. If the system didn't change, then others like Calloway would rise again. Naomi knew this. She had spent her entire career watching how deep-seated racism poisoned law enforcement. Now, she finally had the power to fix it, and she wouldn't waste it. The morning after Briggs's arrest, Naomi stood before her command staff. Some were loyal allies, some were nervous skeptics, and a few still resented her. She didn't care. From this day forward, every officer in this department will undergo mandatory anti-racism training. The room fell silent. A senior lieutenant, a man in his late 50s, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Chief, with all due respect, do you really think training can fix this? Naomi locked eyes with him. No, but it's a start. She let her words settle in. Training alone won't erase bias, but it will force officers to confront it, to acknowledge the problem, and to start being part of the solution. No one dared to challenge her. The new era had begun. Within weeks, the department partnered with civil rights organizations to design a groundbreaking program. Mandatory anti-racism workshops, implicit bias training for all officers, de-escalation tactics to reduce unnecessary force, real-life case studies, including Calloway's actions, as examples of what not to do. Some officers embraced the change. Others resisted it. They grumbled. They questioned the need. But Naomi stood firm. If you refuse to be part of this, you don't belong in law enforcement. And just like that, the old ways started to die. Training officers was one step, but the real test? Winning back the community. Decades of abuse had shattered trust between black citizens and the police. Naomi knew that trust couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned. So she did something no chief before her had done. She held town hall meetings, face to face, with the people. She listened to their stories of fear, anger, and pain. She invited local activists to review department policies. She empowered citizens to file complaints directly to her office. Some people were skeptical. Some refused to believe anything would change. But when they saw bad cops getting fired and new policies taking shape, slowly, very slowly, they started to hope again. Months later, Naomi walked through the neighborhood where it all began. The café, the scene of Briggs's downfall, was busy as ever. This time she wasn't undercover. She wasn't hiding. And when she walked inside, the barista, a young black woman, smiled at her. "Chief Carter." Naomi nodded. For the first time in a long time, she felt something rare. Something she had fought so hard for. Change. The reforms were underway. Corrupt officers had been exposed and removed. The community was beginning to trust again. But Naomi knew the truth. This was just the first battle. The system was deeply rooted in injustice, and real change would take years, not months. She wasn't naive. She was ready. Late at night, Naomi stood alone in her office. The city lights glowed beyond her window, stretching into the horizon. On her desk, stacks of complaints still needing review. Reports of officers resisting the new policies. Letters from citizens, some thanking her, some demanding more. She ran a hand over her badge. Being chief of police wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about fighting for something bigger. Fighting for justice, fighting for dignity, fighting for every person who had been silenced. And she wouldn't stop now. The next morning, the city gathered for a press conference. The case had drawn national attention. Everyone, citizens, activists, reporters, officers, waited for her words. Naomi stepped up to the podium, took a deep breath, and spoke. What happened in that cafe was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger disease, a disease that has existed in our institutions for far too long. The crowd stilled. But let me be clear. Change is coming, not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. Her voice carried strength. She wasn't just talking to the people. She was talking to every officer who thought they could still get away with abuse. Accountability is not an option, it is a requirement. Every officer in this department, myself included, must answer to the people we serve. People nodded, murmured, clapped. She wasn't just saying what they wanted to hear. She was telling them the truth. And they believed her. As Naomi left the stage, a young girl, no older than 10, ran up to her. A small black girl with wide, hopeful eyes. She hesitated, then whispered, "You're the reason I want to be a cop someday." Naomi knelt, meeting her gaze. "Then promise me something," she said softly. The girl nodded. "Promise me that when it's your turn, you'll make this world better than you found it." The girl's eyes lit up. "I promise." Naomi smiled. This fight, it wasn't just for today. It was for tomorrow. It was for tomorrow. And as long as she had breath in her body, she would never stop fighting.